I had the blues so bad one time it put my face in a permanent frown. Now I'm feeling so much better I can cakewalk in the town.
Hey everyone. Dude, I was sick this week. I was horribly sick Wednesday and Thursday of this week. Really only getting over it Thursday night. Hoy. And then, on top of that, on Friday of this week, my daughter's school closed. Because there were so many teachers who are sick right now and not enough subs to take their place. And my wife was in a position where she couldn't take off time to look after the kid. And by the time we learned about the closure, it was too late to call family. So she was my responsibility on Friday. So what I am trying to say here is that as much as I hate doing this, and I assure you that I do, this week is going to be another one where I'm going to Frankenstein a bunch of old lecture videos and stitch them together to make this one. I'm having to do that because we only recently decided to put the Renaissance at the beginning of this semester. It had been at the end of the fall semester. We did some restructuring. And so I've got lectures from a couple of different semesters and things that I'm going to have to sort of stitch together. Just be aware. You're going to see wardrobe changes and all kinds of stuff that are going to happen here. And I'm sorry. There was not an opportunity to record. I really do like to record each semester new as much as I can because I do enjoy keeping the conversation timely. Because if something has sort of recently happened in the world that I could relate to something that's being talked about in the lecture, I like to be able to do that. But yeah, unfortunately, that just wasn't going to happen this time around. And you're going to see me spring 2022 version of me pop in perhaps a couple of times over these lectures. But for the most part, you're going to get old 2020 and 2021 Jason giving you the information. But anyway, it is week 2. That says week 11. I'll change that for your PDF that you'll get. Again, this would have been week 11 when we did it in the past. We're talking about the early Renaissance. I'm splitting this lecture into 2 parts. It may be 3 or 4 actual videos. But this is part 1 of the 2 lectures, right? And as you can see there, if you have read chapters 11 and 12, you're good. I don't want you to read anything additional, okay? You're good with just that. Okay, all right, so let's dive in. When we ended the last lecture, I told you that there was some information about Northern Europe in the early Renaissance that I wanted to get into, but I decided to cut it short so that we would, so that your first week of lectures wouldn't be too much for you. So we're going to start with that material first. These would be. Well, let's continue, shall we? Let's talk about the same time period, the late Middle Ages into the early Renaissance. But let's hop from Italy into Northern Europe. Specifically, we're talking about France, a kingdom at the time, the Flemish state, Flanders, These would be a grouping of small countries that would eventually become the Netherlands, Brussels, that area up there, and the German kingdom, what was left at this point of the Holy Roman Empire, which was down to just a small portion of what it had once been. So, some changes that contributed to the early Renaissance in Northern Europe. Rinse and repeat, just like we were saying in Italy, there were many cities and nations that became independently wealthy apart from the church due to commerce. So, wealthy people in these areas, as a result, could purchase art. The church and the aristocracy still commissioned art, but they weren't the only customers anymore. Then in the north, we have some changes in religious expression as the Catholic Church, actually during this particular period of time, had a split. And for a time, there were two popes. There was the one in Rome, in the Vatican, but there was also a pope in France until that all got mended. The divide was eventually repaired in 1417, but the church's reputation was tarnished in the north as a result. Then there was increased literacy in the north, particularly due to an inventor by the name of Johannes Gutenberg. He was in Germany, who invented the printing press and movable type in 1439. And so people began to turn to religious movements that encouraged personal reading and meditation on sacred text to develop a personal relationship with God. Books began to be printed, and the ancient texts start to get translations into what would have been modern languages at the time, from the old ancient Greek and Roman languages, Greek and Latin, that is. So that, and that was specifically to meet the desire of this new class of people who could afford those things. As well, there started to be some political changes during this era. So France had been mired in what was known as the 100 Years' War, and this finally comes to an end. At this time, this was a war that they were in with England for a long time, hence the 100 Years' War. Flanders, during this time, becomes this economic powerhouse, right? Flanders and the area that would eventually become known as Holland in particular, this period of time is going to be the beginning of a time of economic boom for that area, and it's because of its sort of geographic situation on the continent of Europe. Spain became unified by the marriage of Queen Isabella and Queen Ferdinand during this time. If you don't recognize those names, those would be the people who sent Christopher Columbus on his way. We're getting very close to that period of time. And there you have it, right? There were government-funded missions to find new trade routes, which resulted in actually the discovery of the American continents. Not so much the discovery, but for Europeans going out and learning, let's say, that there were a couple of extra continents on the planet that they hadn't realized were there. Now, during this time, art was still considered a craft. It's not going to be for much longer, but at this particular moment in time, it's still considered a craft. And so those who wanted to pursue a career in art had to join up with the Guild of St. Luke. Remember that St. Luke was, traditionally is considered the first icon painter, and as such, the Guild. Well, this would have been kind of like not unlike the modern day equivalent of a labor union, right? The Guild of St. Luke by joining the guild, you would get guild training and membership in the guild, and that would be required to be a professional artist. It was a way of putting like a stamp of approval, if you will. The guild would say you get trained in the system where there's a master artist. You're going to work as an apprentice under that artist until that artist feels like you have learned all that you can learn, and then you will make your masterpiece. You may have heard that term before, right? That the masterpiece at this particular time would be when the artist that was your master would say, I want to see what you can do. And if you had made a piece that proved you to be worthy of being a master in the guild, then you would move on to being a master and you would take on apprentices. They could, as a result, they controlled the training in art, but they also controlled say pricing and things that they regulated pricing and things of that nature. And that's how that was done, right? Art had not yet moved into the universities. All right, so I'm not sure. I'm up here in the corner. I'm not sure. I'll move myself if I need to, if it turns out I need to during this video. This little video right here is one I found by the Storybots. Yes, it's a kids show, but they do this really great job, I think, in this particular video of explaining Johannes Gutenberg's invention and why it was important. So I'll just go ahead and start it.
Storybots. Storybots presents Great Innovator. In the days of castles, kings, and knights, a book was something rare. It was made by hand for wealthy folk, with lots of gold to spare. Till a clever man named Gutenberg said,
That's a shame indeed. If making books was quick and cheap, then everyone could read.
So he launched a secret project in the workshop where he'd hide, and townsfolk often stopped to ask,
What's going on inside?
Well, Gutenberg was hard at work with all his expertise. He invented little molds to make his metal ABCs. He'd arrange them in a block of type and smear it all with ink, then press it down on paper.
Not as easy as you'd think.
For years he toiled and tinkered, till at last he found success. He unveiled his great invention.
Look, I've made the printing press.
He printed up some school books, which were nice but just a start. But then he made his famous Bibles, which were splendid works of art.
Whoa.
The printing press soon changed the world. Now everyone had books. Not only kings and noblemen, but farmers, maids, and cooks. So today, whenever you enjoy a book or magazine, just remember that it started out with Gutenberg's machine.
It's silly. I know that it's silly, but I love it. And I think it distills down the story very nicely. So yeah, so Johannes Gutenberg, right? Now you already know from what we talked about when we talked about art in the Middle Ages that books, illuminated manuscripts, what have you, were not inexpensive things to own. Right? They were made by hand by scribes and artists, and they were made by nuns and monks who were among the most literate people in Europe at the time. And what they were trained to do was not something that everyone could do. And so literature was really something that was only in the realm of the most wealthy or the church. Gutenberg was seeking a way of making that inexpensive and making it something perhaps mechanical and easy to reproduce. Well, by this point, there were already starting to be artists who were starting to create prints by pressing wood that had been carved in a certain way and covered in ink and pressed down. And there was the wine press, right? This was a press for squeezing the juice out of grapes for making wine. And, you know, Gutenberg sort of saw that as a means of potentially recreating and printing text onto pages. Now, understand, Gutenberg gets a lot of the credit, but in fact, over in China, much earlier than this, they had developed something interestingly similar. But where Gutenberg, in Europe at least, where his genius was in particular was movable type. We'll talk about that in depth in a moment, but understand that Gutenberg and his apprentices and things of that nature, as it mentioned, they once they had the printing press figured out and operational, they made a few textbooks and things of that nature. But where he really made his name was with what is now referred to as the Gutenberg Bible, and this was a Bible that Gutenberg and his company, let's say, chose to take on the challenge. Like, they wanted to be able to challenge the scribes who were producing Bibles for wealthy people, and so they created this Bible, which was made to look, the first text that they used was made to look like the scribes had done it. He's doing this in such a way as to mimic what they were doing. But because he can do it in a very fast and inexpensive manner, it was made affordable and available to not just the wealthiest, but to some who are more in the middle class. Sorry, I had some notes that I forgot to get to. So about 180 of them were printed that we know of for sure, and 49 still survive today, unless there are some that are hidden someplace and haven't been found yet. And there were the Bibles were done in multiple volumes. Each volume by itself, like that's a volume of it right there that you see, weighed 35 pounds. These things were quite huge. So how did he go about it, right? And create this thing that really, to a certain extent, is still kind of the template upon which Bibles are based even now. Well, as I said, his first sort of genius move was movable type, right? Movable type is what you saw in that video. They were these little pieces of metal that had an embossed letter on the end, letter or a character, right? It could be punctuation or a number, something like that. That would have been in reverse, right? And on a large plate that he was going to use for pressing, he could slide these letters in. He or his apprentices or whomever could slide these different movable type letters into place, spread ink on that, flip it over, have the press down onto the paper, lift up, and it would leave the lettering behind. And so what he decided to do to keep this Bible consistent is did 40 lines of type, top to bottom, and in 2 columns. All right? The font, as I mentioned, was designed to mimic the handwritten script of the scribes. You can see that, right? That's meant to look like what the scribes were writing. And in fact, many of the earliest fonts that were used, that have stayed with us even to this day, are based on the very specific scripts that the scribes developed during the Middle Ages. Surprisingly, quite a few of them do. And I have to move. Then there's what's called the rubrication. That's this little bit up here in red. They're called rubrics. And this would have been a red ink heading of each book that was made to mimic the same practice that the scribes had. They would write this little heading before chapters or at the beginning of a book, rather, a book of the Bible. And initially, he printed those, right? But that meant that each page that had a rubric on it, he had to put through the printing press twice. So eventually, to save himself a little bit of money, these were done by hand, and the spaces would be left blank, knowing that there would be someone who would come in and write that stuff there at the top. Then he added just a touch of illumination, right? Like what you see right there with this really large and decorative letter E right here, right? Again, meant to mimic what the scribes were doing. So wide margin. I mean, you can see there's wide margins all around on all four sides of the page. These were left blank for the eventual hand painted illuminations that would be put on it. But they weren't put on all of them, because what he did was, you want to pay a little more for your Bible? We'll put in the fancy illuminations. So the more expensive ones were highly illuminated, but others, because again, he wanted this to be something that would be affordable to not just the super uber wealthy, but the middle class and those who previously had not been able to have a Bible in their homes. And so there were others that he would leave just completely unilluminated, so that someone could afford the cheaper version, right? There are two big artistic innovations that happen in Northern Europe around about this time. These are a big deal, and they happen in the north first, and then they sort of get transplanted into southern Europe, where most historians sort of point to Italy as being where the Renaissance begins. But it was kind of dependent upon these things that happened in the north, and were sort of brought down. Number one was oil painting. Oil painting was done by having dried colored pigments mixed with vegetable oils. It's still done that way to this day. Oils dried slowly. Prior to this time, and current to this time in Italy, most painting was done with using tempera, which used egg instead of what eventually would be oil. Egg would get mixed with pigments, and it dried very quickly. Since oils dried slowly, it meant that there was time to do lots of blending, and that you could put layers of glazes on, because you could mix the paint with more oil than paint, and you could put a glaze over a layer that had dried already. Second, now, yes, we have already talked about naturalism based on observation as going on in Italy at the time as well, particularly in Siena. But they are nowhere near as obsessed with it as they are in the north. In Italy, they're still a little caught up in idealization, right? They're reaching back to ancient Greece, and ancient Greece's obsession with idealizing and making human beings look even more perfect than they are. In the north, they don't mind if things look true to life. So there's this style that develops in the north that takes the Gothic way of making art and blends it with the new naturalism that was coming out of Italy. And the Flemish painters in particular became very obsessed with naturalism and the most minute detail. I mean, look at this painting that I've got on the screen right now by Jan van Eyck. Right, this particular painting has got so much detail in it, so much so that it is said that people have been able to figure out the prescription of this guy's glasses. This guy was the patron who paid for this painting, right? By looking at the magnification of the words in this book in his glasses, and also by looking at some of the veins and things in his head, and by reading the records of how he died, they were able to diagnose what disease had killed him, right? That's the level of detail that they were hung up on. And also in those Flemish paintings, we're going to see the depicted objects imbued with tons of symbolism. Excuse me. Nothing is ever just included in a Flemish painting from this period of time without there being a reason for why it's there. It's symbolic of something. I mean, look at Mary's not just sitting on any throne. The throne is covered with like little statues, and there are lots of different things going on in the tapestry. all sorts of items that are being held by different characters. And, this guy has a book and a pair of glasses for a reason. Like, there's symbolism run amok in all of this. So we will look at a style known as International Gothic that arrives in the late 14th and early 15th centuries in France. So International Gothic. First, I want to remind you of the Gothic sculpture that we talked about, at least briefly, when we looked at Notre Dame Cathedral. Right? The Gothic sculpture from the Middle Ages, right, is very monumental, often very structural to whatever building it's attached to. The figures are elongated, they're expressionless, they're cold, they're stern, they're very influenced by early Christian and Byzantine art in that way, and they often have the very generic faces. Well, International Gothic is a style that starts sweeping through Northern Europe at this point that is a synthesis of that old Gothic way of making art and the new obsession with observational naturalism that, again, has come out of the South but has really taken root amongst artists in Northern Europe. Like this piece right here, The Well of Moses by Klaus Schluter. This would be in France, that he worked on between 1395 and 1406. Right? And in this particular, it's called the Well of Moses because up above in this area up here, once upon a time, there was a fountain and water would sort of pour out of it. But around it, we have Moses and 5 other Old Testament prophets, David, Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Zechariah, all arranged around this. And if you look here, this is Moses. You might ask, how do I know that this is Moses? Well, a couple of reasons. And again, objects are always imbued with symbolism in the North. He's holding the tablets. He has the 2 tablets in hand. But also, there was an interesting mistranslation in the Latin version of the Bible that, in Genesis, no, I'm sorry, not Genesis. In Exodus, when Moses is described after he has gone up and has talked to God through the burning bush, and he comes down, and the modern translations, at least in English, say that his countenance had changed, right? Well, there was an interesting little mistranslation of that said that Moses came down from the mountain and he had horns on his head. And so in medieval and a lot of Renaissance depictions of Moses, you're going to see Moses as a long, bearded old man, and he's going to have horns sticking out of his head. That's how I know who that is. Now, again, International Gothic, we can see being demonstrated here through the Gothic architectural elements. The fountain itself is very Gothic in its design, and the fact that the statues themselves are structural and part of it. They're part of that structure there. That's very Gothic in nature. But the faces and the hair are very clearly based on close observation from nature. You can tell that models have been chosen and that Schluter has looked at hair and beards and is trying to recreate that from eyesight, from observation. And there's an extreme attention to detail, even though this is marble. This is made from marble, and yet he's paying attention to details like texture, the texture, and making, even though it's stone, making it look like those different textures: skin, hair, fabric, leather, metal even, right? All those things he's representing by paying attention to how to portray those textures as they are observed in nature. But here's another little thing that's interesting and will come into play as we move into the Renaissance as well. And that's this right here. This is King David. Right? This is King David. But when we look at him, he does not look like a king in ancient Palestine, ancient Israel. No, in fact, he is being presented as a modern day French monarch would have looked in this particular time period. Why? Because that made it very easy for those who would come to this to recognize that that's a king, right? Use the symbols that the people who are looking at it are going to understand. And so you're going to notice as we dive into artwork in this particular period, but also as we get into the Renaissance, that a lot of times you're going to find events and stories that are being illustrated in art that should have happened hundreds, if not thousands of years before the time period in which they were painted, and yet it will be painted with people who are in modern clothing and will oftentimes be painted as if it's happening in the city or at least the country in which the painting itself was made. And that, again, is very Renaissance in nature and very much is a break from the Middle Ages, right? Because again, there's in this case, it's certainly a matter of using what the people know in order to communicate something to help them understand that very easily. But it's also going to be a means of showcasing civic pride and a pride in ourselves as humans. It's a humanistic endeavor to do something like that, right? To set events that you read about in your religious text, things that happened hundreds and thousands of years prior to the time in which you are making your art, but make it happen now and make it happen in the place that you live when it's portrayed. Right? Now to us, we're going to look at these things like even that right there, right? We look at that king right there and he feels kind of ancient to us, right? It might not immediately occur to you and me that right there would have been a modern day looking king. But in 1406, when this piece was unveiled, people would have looked at that and it would have been like in this day and age if a man were standing there in a suit and tie, right? They would have recognized immediately that was a king. And that's the way that kings looked and dressed and groomed themselves at that particular time and place. And that's something to keep in mind as we go forward. So, I forgot to remove some names. Some of these names have been edited out of this video. We're specifically going to look at, when we talk about the new art in Flanders, we're specifically going to look at Jan van Eyck. It looks like Jan van Eyck or something like that. It's Jan van Eyck. Jan van Eyck and his brother Hubert van Eyck are often given credit for being the quote-unquote inventors of oil plate painting. There's at least one artist who it's argued whether or not he was making his work before Jan van Eyck. But at the very least, he and his brother Hubert were early innovators, if nothing else. Because of his political connections, because he was really well politically, really well connected politically, he was able to bypass the guild system. He wasn't involved in the Guild of St. Luke. He studied by taking a look at the international Gothic style that was happening in sculpture, and also made his way down south to the Italian peninsula and took a look at Giotto and what his students had been doing in the time before him. Jan van Eyck, as you see, 1399 to 1441. Giotto and his students were the generation prior, but their work was there to be viewed. And he's going to take those and play around with it. And hang on. Another interesting thing about him is that he signed. We know a lot of his work is his because he signed and dated much of his work which was not common in the north in particular. It was starting to become more common, as we talked about, in Italy. But in the north, that was still not very common. It was very much still mired in medieval ways of thinking at the time. This is a particularly famous piece of Jan van Eyck's, the Ghent altarpiece. This is what the altarpiece looks like when it's open. Move myself out of the way so you can sort of see what was happening over there. So an altarpiece, we've already talked about what an altarpiece is. Sometimes, however, altarpieces are made up of multiple, not just of multiple panels, not just of a front and a back, but of an inside and an outside. All right, so this piece here, as you can see, has hinges here and here, and that's because these outer panels, right, would have closed over and covered up this central panel, these central panels. And what's on the outside would probably be on display most times of the year. And then this would be displayed on special occasions, special feast days, things of that nature. All right. So why this painting is of importance? First off, it's the painting that made Jan van Eyck's reputation. His brother Hubert, as you can see down there, it mentions that Hubert and Jan van Eyck worked on this piece. Hubert sadly died while this piece was unfinished. So Jan van Eyck came in and finished it up, and to all accounts, or by all accounts, improved upon what his brother had been doing. When this is, again, I mentioned this is open, and when it's shut, you have like the donors who are portrayed on the outside. You see how that was becoming a thing, especially once we hit the Renaissance. It became a thing in the Middle Ages, right? The donors, the patrons who paid for the work being portrayed in the work in some way. So what we see here, we have essentially the beginnings of the final judgment, right? We kind of have the story, the Judeo-Christian story of both creation and the end of the world, right? Because we have up here in the upper panels, over here to the left, and over here to the right, Adam and Eve, right? Up here, we have a very interesting thing. We have God portrayed as a human being, portrayed as a human king. He would have been very recognizable as a king in this outfit that he's wearing. That's very much not the way things would have been done in the Middle Ages, where that would have been almost considered blasphemous. But here, it seems Jan van Eyck and his patrons don't have a problem with that anymore. And God here is portrayed as a person. And he's overseeing everything. We've got Mary over here on one side. There she is holding her book. And over here on the other, we have John the Baptist. And below, we have a representation of the scene in Revelation, where the lamb, the sacrificial lamb, is to be visited by peoples who come from the four corners of the earth. You'll notice there are people coming from four separate directions. Jan van Eyck, as you can see, is in these panels including an extreme amount of detail, which was really only made possible because of the versatility of oil paint. Like every surface is covered in the smallest, minutest of details. As well as we haven't talked about this just yet, but what we are going to be seeing in Italy around about this time is a return to the idealization of the ancient Greeks. Right, in southern Europe, in Italy and in Spain, artists are going to be looking back to ancient Greece and seeing how ancient Greece was very much about trying to perfect the human form in artwork and idealize the human form. In the North, they don't care. They're much more Roman in that way. In the North, they like to portray their people, warts and all. And you can see that here with Adam and Eve in their separate panels, right? There's not in either one of them any sense of trying to give them perfect proportions, or to give Adam some sort of beefy athletic body. In fact, he's kind of sinewy and not exactly doughy by any means, right? But he's not athletic. He's a bit scrawny, in fact. Mary is allowed to not be sort of the perfected, she's certainly not being treated as sort of classically beautiful, right? And in both Adam and Eve, their faces don't seem to have a kind of classic beauty about them, right? There's not that tendency to want to idealize in the North, right? As well as there's symbolism in the story here. There's symbolism. There is certainly symbolism in that apple that Eve is holding, because that is representative of original sin. But the two of them are pictured here having just realized that they've sinned, right? And sin has now entered their lives. They're now ashamed, right? And again, in a very medieval way of thinking about human history, this is the moment at which evil has entered the world. It's the moment at which human beings from this point until the end of time must suffer because of what's happened with these two. And look at their faces. The gravity of what they have done has just hit them. And their faces are in shock, are in sorrow, are ashamed. I mean, Adam's trying to cover himself up. Eve is, at least to a certain extent, though her hand is a little more limp than Adam's is here, right? And that's still hanging on to some Gothic ideology, right? But the painting of the two of them is something that is paying extreme attention to observational realism. Because he can work in glazes of oil color, he can get that sort of translucency of skin, right? Because skin is an interesting material. Light doesn't just hit it and bounce back. There is some light that hits skin and bounces back to our eyes, but some dives underneath the surface because of the way skin is made up. And so skin has this tendency to also kind of glow from within. Light sort of diving inside, bouncing around all those blood vessels and things of that nature, and then coming outward, right? So that light on skin, there's sort of two layers to it. There's the light that hits it and bounces back and immediately meets our eyes. And there's sort of a secondary light that can almost feel like it glows from within. It's why even right now, because I've got a lamp that's sort of up there, my forehead can look just pure white on the camera here, right? And it's because of the light sort of going in and bouncing around and coming out. And skin can be very luminous. And you see, come on, laser pointer. Yeah, you see Jan van Eyck paying attention to that in the ways that the light sort of hits and bounces off of the skin in certain places, and how that with skin, other materials as well, but it's particularly noticeable in skin. Even in shadow areas, bits of light can get in there and kind of bounce around. So you have things like, even though this side of Adam's arm is in shadow, notice that little glint of light right there, or the shadow portion of the leg, or even down into this shadow portion, and how a little bit of light seems to be bouncing from some source over here back up into the shadow, right? He's paying super close attention to those things. He's thinking about the skin also as a material that's being stretched over muscle, in this case very sinewy muscle, but muscle nonetheless, and bone, and trying to really capture those textures and effects of light. And like I say, the northern artist, Jan van Eyck here is just being our representative of all of the northern artists, were absolutely obsessed with detail. I mean, this this altarpiece is really large, and all this detail that he has painted into it is just like every single surface. Look at everything he's thinking about. He's got all of the little individual jewels that are in this, like, brooch kind of thing. The bits of fabric that hang down here, all the little jewels in that, right? He's not just painting sort of a general shape of a beard. No, Van Eyck is obsessed with every single strand of the beard. This is a tapestry behind him, and if we could get even closer on it, we would see that he spent time getting every single little thread of this tapestry back here. Then he's paying attention to the velvety nature of the fabric that's here, and again, that luminosity of the skin. Again, all these different jewels up here. That extreme attention to detail that when we just look at a scene, there's no way in just one quick glance at anything that we look at we would ever pick up on that amount of detail. But Jan van Eyck and other northern painters like him are so obsessed they cannot leave that detail out. For one, they sort of see it as the showcasing of their talent, that they do include all of that. Secondly, all of the objects within a painting for the northern artist is imbued with symbolism. And so any of those little items left out would detract from that symbolistic meaning that's behind everything. So for instance, the Arnolfini wedding from 1434. Often when I present this in the class, I wish I could. This is one of those times I wish I was actually with you so that I could ask this question. But when I ask people what they think they see happening here, most people believe that they see a shotgun wedding happening. Because they look at the woman and they say she appears to be pregnant. They look at the fact that this is happening inside the house and not in a church somewhere. And they think that what they see is someone who has gotten a young woman pregnant and is trying to make it right by marrying her quietly. To which I always say, all right, if that's the case, then why hire Jan van Eyck to document it? Jan van Eyck didn't just decide to just paint these two, right? This was a commission by Arnolfini himself. We have his name. So why would he commemorate something like that? Especially in 1434, where something of that nature would very much have been frowned upon. Right? If anything, he would have had this presented like the classical wedding we're thinking it should be if he's not having a shotgun wedding. But no, in fact, just the opposite's happening. Right? In 1434, much less was required for a wedding to be official than it is today, right? They weren't always done in the church. Sometimes they were done in someone's home. You needed to say the right vows, and there needed to be someone present as a witness who could say, "Yep, these things happened." All right, and that's what's happening. These two are getting married in a perfectly acceptable manner for 1434. All right? So then what is going on here? Well, this painting is actually a marriage contract. It is the thing to prove that these two have gotten married. If you'll notice, here in the middle, there is a mirror. It's a little hard to tell on your screen, I imagine, but in this mirror, we can see Jan van Eyck and one other person. They're in the room. They are where we are, right? We seem to be standing where the people in that mirror must be standing. And above all of this, Jan van Eyck has signed it, and specifically he's written Jan van Eyck was here. Because he's the witness to this thing. And then, as I said, look. First, let me touch on this. Everything that we just talked about when it comes to northern painting of the time is here. There's the lack of idealization, maybe this young woman's been idealized a little bit. Maybe she looks a little more classically beautiful than she may have been, but maybe not. Certainly, Arnolfini has been allowed to look just as ugly as he most likely did in life. That's no judgment, right? I'm just saying they haven't tried to dress him up and make him pretty. So there's not the sense that there needs to be idealization going on there, and that's again very Gothic in nature. And we have that obsessive attention to observational realism and to getting every single little detail correct, but also there's a huge amount of symbolism. Everything that is on the page is symbolic. Everything on the page, everything on what would have been a wooden board. For instance, there's the fact that Arnolfini isn't wearing his shoes. His shoes are over here, right? Symbolic of the Judeo-Christian idea of being on sacred ground. If you're on holy ground, you remove your shoes. There's a dog, excuse me, there's a dog standing between them, right? A dog being the symbol of fidelity. I mean, come on, common dog name is Fido, right? Fidelity, right? Because a dog is faithful to its owner. So that's and that dog stands between the two individuals who are making a vow. Now, people will say, well, what about that little pregnant belly? Well, for one, this was a style of dress at the time where there was lots of flowing fabric and pleats and things of that nature. And oftentimes, in order to even be able to walk, a young lady might have to gather it up in order to be able to walk. So that's being hinted to, but also there's a symbolism there. She's holding that up, and it makes her look as though she's pregnant because, again, this is the marriage contract. And whatever might be expected in a marriage in 2020 may be a very different thing, but let's understand this is 1334 in northern, extremely Christian Europe at the time. The agreement here is very much that Arnolfini is going to be the breadwinner. He's going to go out into the world. He's going to take care of the family. And in return, his bride is going to take care of the home and is going to rear children. So holding up that bit of fabric there, making herself look pregnant, is a promise to bear children. On Arnolfini's side, well, for one, he's dressed in these furs, which are that means he's extremely rich. Anyone who could wear something like that in 1434 is an extremely wealthy individual. Now, he's standing on the side of the room where there is a window. And as simple as that might seem, there's a window, right? Windows, they need windows in order to have light in the room. But no, everything is symbolic. Everything is symbolic in the North. And that window is an indication of the outside world. And there's Arnolfini standing near that, his promise again being that he will go out into the world and he'll be the one to earn a living and bring that money back home. Additionally, over here, there are some oranges. I don't know how much you know about oranges, but they don't grow in the cold regions of Flanders, right? Those oranges are coming from somewhere warm. They've been shipped here. They've been kept from going bad. The fact that he has those also suggests he's rich, and they're also indicative and symbolic of the fruits of the world. He's going to bring the fruits of the world back into this house. On the bride's side, first off, we have that red bed behind her. Well, let's not even go there yet. Hanging here on the wall, we have a like feather duster or broom kind of thing, a symbol of domesticity. She is promising that she is going to take care of the home, to keep it clean, things of that nature, right? And then over here, as I say, there's the bed. All right, and that bed, everything on that bed is red. Now, this is the one that always makes a few people squeamish in the classroom. Because I say, all right, that bed. She's standing on the same side as the bed. What does that suggest that she is promising? And there will be those students who point out rightfully that because she is holding up this and showing that she will bear children, well, the place where you make those children is in the bed. Right? So she's making that promise. Right? But why red? Why are the sheets red? Why is everything on that bed red? And people will think and think and think, and they're like, oh, well, maybe the red means that it's Arnolfini is rich, so he's got red sheets that have been dyed. And yeah, maybe, perhaps. A few other ideas will be thrown out, and then I always say, look, what happens after the wedding vows? People will often be like, oh, yeah, well, you go back and you consummate the marriage. Yes. And what other things could potentially make the sheets red? And that's the moment where a few people catch on and they snicker and things of that nature. Right? It's 1434. For this marriage, it's a patriarchal society in which these two were living. For this marriage to be binding, she needs to be a virgin. It's one of the sad truths of late medieval and definitely into the Renaissance era in Europe. Right? Women were considered virtuous if they were virgins. Right? So she symbolically, through that red bed, is promising that he gets her virginity on their consummation night. Right? That she is a virgin. There it is. Promise. Right? And then the whole thing up above, there's this chandelier, right? But the chandelier only has one candle. And only one. And that's no accident either, because that is very symbolic of God. Up above, watching over this these entire proceedings, gracing this marriage, right? There's God as the witness up there. So what seemed like something sketchy when we first began turns out to be, at the time, a quite suitable marriage contract that shows the promise that these two are making to one another. Again, the dog down there, that they're going to be faithful and they're going to do all of this under the watchful eye of God and consider their home to be sacred. Right? All that symbolism in this image, all of it coming from the objects, and if you can count the dog as an object, all these objects that are telling us stories outside of themselves just as images.